Welcome to our special Easter podcast of The Money Fish and the Fig Tree, or Why the Romans Killed Jesus. Now, just to get some stuff out of the way, if you're interested in a written transcript of this podcast, you'll see a link underneath the YouTube in the information section where you can click on that and download a PDF of the transcript. About money changers in the Jerusalem temple. Money changing was very common in the Roman Near East, where there was a proliferation of currency systems and standards. In Palestine, as in Egypt, each district had its own royal bank retaining from Hellenistic times, and probably each village had its own money changer. In the period of the Second Temple, when Jesus lived, vast numbers of Jews streamed to Palestine and Jerusalem out of every nation under heaven, according to Acts 2, verse 5. And they took with them considerable sums of money in foreign currencies. This is referred to in the famous instance of Jesus' driving of the money changers out of the temple, which you'll find in Matthew chapter 21, starting at verse 12. Not only did these foreign coins have to be changed, but also ordinary deposits were often handed over to the temple authorities for safe deposit in the temple treasury. People coming from distant countries would bring their money in large denominations rather than in cumbersome small coins. Thus, the money changers fulfilled three major functions. Number one, foreign currency exchange. Number two, the changing of large denominations into smaller ones, and vice versa. And finally, banking. Now, the times we're concerned with for these instances is during Passover. The money changers in Jerusalem used to set up their tables in the outer court of the temple for the convenience of the numerous Passover pilgrims, especially those from foreign countries. Archaeological excavations around the temple walls have uncovered stores or kiosks, some of which, it has been surmised, were occupied by the money changers. The Mishnah states that on the 15th of Adar, every year, tables were set up in Jerusalem for the collection of the statutory annual half-shekel temple tax, and on the 25th of Adar, they were set up in the temple itself. The activity of the Jewish bankers were of a closely defined nature, as these transactions had to be in accordance with the biblical prohibition against taking interest. While loaning money for instant interest is against Jewish law, the first two services mentioned were performed for a fee of between 4 to 8% and were perfectly legal and necessary for the purchase of sacrificial animals by Passover pilgrims. Of course, this is according to the Sadducees, who ran the temple. Other Jewish groups might have had different opinions. The temple tax of a half shekel was a tax paid by Israelites and Levites, which went towards the upkeep of the Jewish temple, as reported in the New Testament. Traditionally, the Sadducees were exempt from the tax. They ran the temple, so rank hath its privileges. During the time of Jesus, payment of the temple tax was a politically contentious issue. There was serious theological conflict between the Sadducee custodians of the temple and the Pharisee and Essene sects over animal sacrifice, relations with Rome, and the use of the Jewish army. Jesus, as most likely an Essene, was in violent disagreement with what went on in the temple, so we can assume that payment of the temple tax was a no for him. So with that prelude, we now get to the story of the money fish, or paying the double drachma temple tax. I'll be quoting from Matthew chapter 17, verses 24 through 27. Now when they arrived in Capernaum, the ones who collected the half-shekel temple tax came up to Peter and said, "Does your rabbi not pay the double drachma tax?" Peter replied, "Yes." So when Peter went back to the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect taxes or tolls? From their own sons or from foreigners?" And when Simon said, "From foreigners," Jesus said to him, "Then the sons are exempt. But so that we do not give offense to them, go out to the sea, cast a line with a hook, and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take that and give it to them to pay the temple tax for me and you." Let me be very clear here. This is not a miracle story. We're not going to give serious credence to the fact that there are fish swimming around with money in their mouths. Today, most Christians suffer from thinking about Jesus as too high up and too much like God. We think of Jesus as the Son of God, God incarnate. Therefore, everything he did as a man must be permeated with the mystique of the divine. Every statement carrying a deep theological, God-filled meaning, and every action a miracle. It seems that he must always be associated with the stuff of wonder and stirring religious import. We almost never think of Jesus as hanging out with the folks, shooting the breeze, having discussions about politics, people, or work. Christians are familiar with Jesus being a carpenter, but the actual Greek word used simply means a tradesman, more like a handyman. That being said, it would appear that his day job never gets reconciled with his divinity. So this brings us to the question, did Jesus have a sense of humor? Or was Jesus political? Did he ever sit around the campfire with the guys and gals, telling stories and discussing the politics of the day? More importantly, is it possible that Jesus was involved in a nonviolent protest against an unfair Roman taxation? One reason why people feel that Jesus was political, and maybe even leading a nonviolent protest against Roman occupation, is the fact that Jesus never gives a yes or no answer when anyone challenges him with a politically loaded question. He either gives a non-answer or responds to the question with another question. This behavior is very much like Greek cynic philosophers. The story of the temple tax indicates that Jesus had an excellent sense of political satire. The problem why most Christians think it's a miracle story and don't get the joke is because humor doesn't transfer well between cultures, especially if those cultures are separated by over 2,000 years. So let's unpack this story and see where the humor lies. The story opens with the temple tax collectors asking Peter if Jesus pays the temple tax. Peter responds with the politically correct answer of yes. However, Peter's in for a surprise when he gets home to Jesus. When he arrived home, Jesus spoke first. "Simon, what's your opinion? The kings of the earth, from whom do they collect duties and taxes? From their sons or from others?" Not taking Peter's politically correct answer for granted, Jesus is immediately asking Peter for an opinion. He wants to know where Rome, here, the kings of the earth, collect their taxes from. The distinction between sons and others is asking the question, does Rome collect taxes from its citizen, the sons, or its conquered nation state, others? After 167 BCE, Rome no longer needed to levy taxes against its own citizens. All Roman income was generated from either conquest spoils or taxes levied against conquered peoples, which are the others here. "From others," Peter answered. Then said Jesus, "The sons are exempt." There is a double play on the word sons going on here. The reference to sons in this verse is now referring to the temple Sadducees who were exempt from Roman taxation. You see, in Jesus' time, the Romans and the Sadducees were one and the same as far as the Pharisees and the Essenes were concerned. In order to keep their political power, the Sadducees had sold out to the Romans and were nothing more than Rome's puppet administrators. This word juggling would have been funny to the average Jew. a way of making fun of the Romans and Sadducees, and at the same time without being politically overt. So now Jesus continues. But to avoid offending them, go to the lake, throw out a line, and take the first fish you catch. Open its mouth, and you will find a shekel. Take it and give it to them for me and for you. There are actually two punchlines here. First, Jesus could have cared less about offending either the Romans or the Sadducees. He viewed both as adversaries, literally a Satan. The word Satan is the English transliteration of a Hebrew word for an adversary in the Bible. The fake concern would have been humorous to Jesus' followers. Secondly, catching a fish with a coin in its mouth is satire at its best. Jesus is saying that you have about as much chance of catching a fish bearing money as you have for me paying the temple tax. The play on Peter being a fisherman by trade adds to the satire. So, slim chance of finding money in a fish and slim chance of Jesus paying the temple tax. There is nothing funnier than a well-crafted satire. Saturday Night Live would be proud. Let's face it, if you have to explain a joke, it's not that funny. But the opportunity to see Jesus as a political satirist could not be missed out on. Hit number one for Jesus against the temple and the money changers here. The Romans took two things very seriously in their occupied territories. The first offense was not paying the Romans their taxes. This would tend to get the offender flogged or beaten as punishment. The Romans were very serious about the issue of their money and control. The second issue, and a much more serious offense, was sedition or outright rebellion against the Roman peace. This rebellion did not have to be armed or violent. Just shooting off your mouth the wrong way, especially if it drew a crowd, was enough to get you crucified. This brings us to Mark's story of Jesus cursing the fig tree. Now, offense number one for Jesus would have been not paying the temple tax. Hit number two comes when Jesus cleanses the temple. This act was not so subtle or politically correct, and most historians agree that the act is what finally put Jesus in front of the Jewish Sanhedrin and on trial before Pontius Pilate. During the time of Jesus, the Sadducees were the priestly sect in charge of the Jewish state and worship in the temple. The temple in Jerusalem functioned as a ritual slaughterhouse for Jewish worship via animal sacrifice. Animals were sacrificed literally around the clock. During holy pilgrimage festivals such as Passover, the rate of sacrifice increased to an unimaginable level due to the influx of pilgrims from all over the world. During Passover, all these people needed to purchase acceptable animals for sacrifice in the temple. It was a rule of the temple that all sacrificial animals had to be purchased with native Jewish coinage, as opposed to Roman or any other country's money. This is why there were money changers in the temple. Again, these money changers were sanctioned by the Sadducees and provided a necessary service for Jewish pilgrims. The money changers exchanged foreign currencies into acceptable temple monies so Jewish pilgrims could purchase their Passover animal sacrifice. Now, just a brief aside here about animal sacrifice. Once the animal was sacrificed, drained of blood, it was actually given back to the person who gave it for sacrifice. They then took the animal home and actually ate it as a meal. So the theory being that this was one of the ways you could commune with God. It was like sharing a meal with God in eating an animal that was sacrificed to God. Also, if you were one of the poorer Jewish people, this was probably one of the few times you ever got to eat meat. That being said, let's take a look at the temple cleansing story in Mark. Note that Mark sandwiches the story of the temple cleansing between two before and after stories of a cursed fig tree. This is a literary structure unique to Mark, wherein the before and after stories expand on the meaning of the story that's been sandwiched in between. Most scholars agree that the temple cleansing, in conjunction with Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday before the adoring crowds, were the actions that pushed the Sadducees over the top to conspire with the Romans to have Jesus done away with. In the end, Jesus died because of his strong Essene convictions against what went on in the temple. So I'll now quote the story of the fig tree that's found in Mark chapter 11, verses 12 through 26. The first part of the story, a barren fig tree is cursed. And on the next day, as they were departing from Bethany, he was hungry. And when he saw from a distance a fig tree that had leaves, he went to see if perhaps he would find anything on it. And when he came up to it, he found nothing except leaves, because it was not the season for figs. And he responded and said to it, "Let no one eat fruit from you any more forever." And his disciple heard this. So this is the first part of the sandwich here. Now, you probably noticed that the little issue of it wasn't the season for figs, yet Jesus curses the fig tree for not having figs. That's been discussed by a lot of different people. I'm going to let it slide by here. It's interesting, but it's not really germane to what we're going to be discussing here. Maybe the subject for another podcast. Anyway, it now moves into the actual cleansing of the temple, which is the meat in the sandwich part of the story. So I'll begin again starting at verse 15 here. And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered into the temple courts and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple courts, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those who were selling doves. And he did not permit anyone to carry objects through the temple courts. And he began to teach and was saying to them, "Is it not written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all the nations,' but you have made it a cave of robbers." And the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and began considering how they could destroy him. For they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was astonished by his teaching. And when evening came, they went out from the city. That's the story of the temple cleansing. We now will finish up the other part of the sandwich here as they leave the temple. So starting at verse 20. And as they passed by early in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." And Jesus answered and said to them, "Have faith in God. Truly I say to you that whoever says to this mountain, 'Be lifted up and thrown into the sea,' and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that when he says this it will happen, it will be done for him. For this reason I say to you, whenever you pray and ask for, believe that you will have received it and it will be done for you. And whenever you stand praying, if you have anything against anyone, forgive them, so that your Father who is in heaven will also forgive you your sins." So let's unpack this story a little bit. The actions performed by Jesus in the temple are fourfold. Number one, he drove out people buying and selling sacrificial animals. Number two, he overturned tables to stop the money changers. Number three, he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And number four, he cursed the Sadducees for turning the temple into a den of robbers. So there's actually four discrete actions there that are interesting in their totality. In addition, in the Gospel of John for this story, Jesus performs the additional actions of beating people with whips made from cords and driving the animals from the temple as well. This is more than just being upset with money transactions within the temple precincts. Jesus' goal is literally to stop sacrificial worship at the Jerusalem temple. And he seems to be very passionate and violent about the lengths he is willing to go in stopping this practice. Many people fixate on money-related issues in relation to sacred buildings when reading this story. But it is likely that the money changers were targeted simply because of their connection to the Sadducees and their supporting role in Roman government. In other words, Roman taxation collection. So there is one additional part of this story that we need to consider here. And it's in Mark chapter 11, verses 27 through 33, where Jesus' authority is challenged in the temple the next day after the cleansing. And they came again to Jerusalem, and as he was walking in the temple courts, the chief priests and scribes and the elders came up to him and said to him, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority for you to do these things?" So Jesus said to them, "I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I am doing these things. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or from men? Answer me." And they began to discuss this with one another, saying, "What should we say? If we say from heaven, he will say, 'Why then did you not believe John?' But if we say from men," they were afraid of the crowd because they all looked upon John as truly a prophet. And they replied to Jesus saying, "We do not know." And Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things." Once again, Jesus refuses to respond to the challenge question from the priests. He answers a question with a question and finishes up by saying nothing. An answer worthy of a true Greek cynic philosopher. So what's going on with the fig tree? It is clearly a metaphor for the role of the Jerusalem temple in worship. Jesus looks for the fruit of the fig tree and seeing none, curses it for lack of productivity. The temple, like the fig tree, was simply existing without being productive in Jewish spiritual life. It was just going through the motions of empty sacrificial ritual. The temple and its Sadducee overseers were not fulfilling their mission of guiding the Jewish people into a communion with God. The fig tree is literally dead, and the temple is spiritually dead. Jesus ends with a lesson on the role of faith about the mountain. Jesus ends with a lesson on the role of faith and persistence in following a truly productive path to God, including the sin-forgiving atonement practices of teshuvah and shalach. One last passage that reinforces Jesus' lack of enthusiasm for a dead Jerusalem temple. It turns out the Romans would make this passage come true. In 65 AD, they would destroy not only the temple, but Jerusalem itself after 10 years of Jewish revolts. Jerusalem's total destruction ended Jewish temple blood sacrifices in deference to the rise of rabbinic Judaism and Jesus' spiritual practices that became Christianity. The passage below from the Gospel of John follows immediately after the temple incident the same day. This follow-up that I just referred to is in John chapter 2, verses 18 through 22. So the Jews answered and said to him, "What sign do you show to us because you are doing these things?" Jesus answered and said to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Then the Jews said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. So when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the saying that Jesus had spoken. Once again here, Jesus answers the question of his authority with a riddle. Jesus, like the prophets, did not sanction blood sacrifice in any form, either as a practice for the forgiveness of sins or communion with God. Jesus' teachings center around the spiritual necessity described by the two Aramaic words teshuvah, meaning return to God through repentance, and shalach, meaning release from the consequences of sin. The daily practice of teshuvah was the commitment or vow symbolized in the baptism of John. It was a form of spiritual atonement performed by each person every day through ritual bathing. The individual practice of teshuvah was Jesus' doctrine for achieving the forgiveness of sins and atonement with God through one's personal forgiveness of other people's sins against you. So that brings us to the end here. Hope you enjoyed the podcast. Hope everybody has a good Easter. And again, we'll be talking to you soon. Take care.